Alright, so we are on the nervous system unit. In this video, I'm introducing the brain and cranial nerves. First, I want to make sure everybody understands the difference between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system we abbreviate by saying CNS, and the peripheral nervous system we abbreviate with PNS. Okay, so the CNS is composed of two organs, the brain and the spinal cord. The PNS is composed of nerves and ganglia. In this video, I am going over the brain and cranial nerves. So let's first talk about nervous tissue. It's the last of the four types of tissues that we have to go over. Now, nervous tissue is unlike all of the other types of tissue. It doesn't have different types. Instead, nervous tissue is characterized by its cells. There are two different types of cells in nervous tissue. There are neurons and neuroglial cells. Let's first focus on neurons, okay? Now, there's three parts that help receive and send signals to and from the brain that we need to identify. So using this cartoon image, we can identify first the soma or cell body, okay? That is this large circle here, all right? This is where signals would be processed. We also have dendrites, which are shown by these squiggly lines coming off of the cell body. Dendrites are actually what receives the signal first. It gets transmitted and processed in the cell body, and then the last part of a neuron is the axon. The axon then transmits the signals to other cells in the body, okay? Now, neuroglial cells, we need to understand that there are 6 of them, all right? 4 are in the CNS and 2 are in the PNS. Astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglial cells, and ependymal cells are in the CNS. Schwann cells and satellite cells are in the PNS. Make sure you can name all 6 and which division they belong in. Okay, let's go over the brain. Now, the brain is divided into 4 different divisions. And luckily for us, this cartoon is colored so that we can clearly see those divisions. The first one and the largest one is the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the majority of the brain. It is all of this tan colored division. The most internal division of the brain is called the diencephalon, and that is colored in blue, okay? So it's all internal. Next, we have the brain stem, which is in purple. It's partly internal, partly external. So you can see here, it's internal, and here it extends inferiorly and becomes external. And lastly, we have the cerebellum, which is inferior and posterior, okay? All right, so let's get into the specifics of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is covered by a thin layer of gray matter called the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex extends into 4 different lobes of the cerebrum. Now, these 4 lobes are easy to remember because they coincide with the cranial bones. We already know the cranial bones. So we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe, okay? Now, the cerebral cortex has all of these grooves throughout it. These are actually called gyri, okay? So gyri is plural, gyrus is singular. In between each gyri, you have a little indentation. That's called the sulci, which is plural, sulcus if it's singular. On the frontal lobe, we have what's called a precentral gyrus, okay? So that nice bulge here. And then we have a central sulcus. So that nice ridge right after the precentral gyrus, okay? And it's a central sulcus, so it is centered. The central sulcus also separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. On the parietal lobe, we have a postcentral gyrus. Post meaning after the central sulcus, so postcentral gyrus. We have the occipital lobe, and then over on the temporal lobe, we have what's called a lateral fissure. And this lateral fissure is actually separating the frontal and the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. So fissures, what is that? A fissure is like a sulcus, except it's much deeper, okay? So usually on these 2D images, you can see it's much darker than normal sulci, okay? Now, if we were to take, these instruments and pull at the lateral fissure, we would find a portion of the cerebral cortex called the insula, okay? If we're looking at the superior view, looking down at the brain, we would see a longitudinal fissure. So this longitudinal fissure extends all the way through the brain. It's a nice deep groove, okay? And this longitudinal fissure separates the two hemispheres. Each brain has a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, separated by the longitudinal fissure. Now, when we dissect brains or look at models of brains, typically we are going to make a sagittal cut. And that is actually right down the longitudinal fissure. So you get either one hemisphere or the other. And that is exactly what we have here. This is a model from class. It is cut sagittally right down the longitudinal fissure. Now, we're going to use this image to identify the rest of the divisions in the brain, okay? So we'll start with the diencephalon. The diencephalon was the most internal division. So, following right along here, this is all the diencephalon, okay? Now, there's three main parts that we need to identify. We'll start with the larger star here, right in the middle of the diencephalon. That's called the thalamus, okay? Then we have an epithalamus and a hypothalamus. We know that epi means above and that hypo means below. So this star is above the thalamus, so that has to be the epithalamus. And this star is below the thalamus, so this is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is more anterior and the epithalamus is posterior. We know that because the epithalamus is closer to the cerebellum, which is the most posterior division. Posterior and inferior division. Okay, right, so the cerebellum is right here. It is posterior and inferior, okay? The brainstem. The brainstem is split into three different parts, okay? Now, if you remember from the first image of the brainstem, part of it was internal and part of it was external. The part that is internal is called midbrain, okay? The midbrain portion of the brainstem is pretty much in the middle of the brain, okay? So it's actually marked with C right here, okay? So it's this portion of the brainstem. And then you move inferiorly and externally, and you reach a nice little bulge, okay? Every brainstem has this nice bulge facing anteriorly on the brainstem. This is called the pons. So you have midbrain in the middle and internal pons, which is the bulge, and then lastly, you have the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is right before the end of the cerebellum, okay? After that cerebellum, it becomes the spinal cord, and we are not talking about that yet. So, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. All right, So that wraps up the 4 divisions of the brain. I also wanted to introduce the cranial nerves to you. There are 12 cranial nerves, all right? They each have a name. We will go over the functions in a later video. Each cranial nerve is numbered. So I would like you to practice matching the name of the nerve to the correct Roman numeral, all right? It's important to understand that cranial nerve 6 is called abducens, that cranial nerve 11 is accessory, all right? So just get familiar with correctly pronouncing these 12 nerves and keeping them in order 1 through 12. We do have a nice mnemonic. Once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are happening to help you keep olfactory, optic, locomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibular, cochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal in order.